On June 11, 1944, static crackled across the communication networks at the Majuro Atoll in the Marshall Islands, signaling a shift from encrypted codes to actionable combat directives for Task Force 58. The command was given to initiate Operation Forager, pushing the fleet toward the Marianas to establish aerial dominance over key Japanese strongholds on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, while bracing for an inevitable hostile counterattack. Lowering his binoculars, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher surveyed an unprecedented naval armada consisting of 15 fleet carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers. None of the assembled commanders could have predicted that this specific maneuver would ignite the most destructive carrier engagement in naval history, ultimately dismantling Japan's airborne maritime strike capabilities forever. By this stage of the Pacific War, American military strategists had learned that aircraft carriers served as far more than mere floating runways. They were the absolute arbiters of contemporary naval supremacy. If you controlled the skies, you effectively dictated the terms of the ocean below, allowing you to project immense power across the sprawling Pacific expanses that had previously shielded the Japanese homeland. The Essex-class carriers stood as the ultimate industrial solution to this monumental strategic challenge, slicing through the ocean swells at a brisk 25 knots. These colossal vessels, boasting a standard displacement of 27,100 tons, featured imposing dimensions, with each hull stretching 872 feet long and spanning 93 feet across the beam. Positioned on the flag bridge of the USS Lexington, Vice Admiral Mitcher observed a massive formation that dominated 40 miles of open water, an armada that integrated 7 Essex-class giants: the USS Essex, USS Yorktown, USS Hornet, USS Bunker Hill, USS Wasp, USS Lexington, and USS Enterprise. Operating alongside them were 8 Independence-class light carriers, including the USS Belleau Wood, USS Baton, USS Monterey, USS Cabot, USS San Jacinto, USS Princeton, USS Langley, and USS Cowpens. Aboard each Essex-class vessel, 3,448 sailors worked tirelessly to support a formidable complement of 90 aircraft. The Standard Air Group was meticulously organized into 4 distinct squadrons, carrying 36 F-6F Hellcat fighters, 36 SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers, and 18 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. The underlying mathematics governing this type of warfare possessed a devastatingly elegant simplicity, relying on 900 total aircraft launching from dynamic platforms capable of striking virtually anywhere in the Pacific theater. To maintain this relentless tempo, every carrier was equipped with 4 high-speed elevators that could shift planes between the hangar and the flight deck in a mere 45 seconds, while the catapult systems could hurl a new aircraft into the sky every 30 seconds during peak operational surges. Captain Arleigh Burke, acting as Mitcher's chief of staff, analyzed these tactical parameters with the exacting precision expected of a Harvard law graduate turned brilliant naval strategist. He understood perfectly that victory on this aquatic battlefield hinged entirely upon the ruthless calculation of launch intervals, recovery timeframes, fuel consumption, and ammunition expenditure, where success or failure was measured in fractions of a minute and mere nautical miles. Meanwhile, aboard the newly commissioned Japanese carrier Taiho, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa meticulously studied his own directives for Operation Eigo. As the crowning achievement of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the Taiho displaced 29,300 tons and housed 75 aircraft, featuring a uniquely heavily armored flight deck explicitly engineered to survive direct impacts from 500-pound bombs. This vessel spearheaded a final, concentrated strike force composed of 9 carriers and 430 aircraft, which included the Pearl Harbor veterans Shokaku and Zuikaku, as well as the fleet carriers Junyo and Hio. Rounding out this defensive wall were the light carriers Ryuho, Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho. However, this seemingly impressive maritime roster masked a catastrophic vulnerability that paralyzed the entirety of Japanese carrier operations by the middle of 1944, the severe and irreversible decline in aviator proficiency. While the seasoned pilots who executed the Pearl Harbor strike boasted an average of 700 flight hours, the aviators currently serving under Ozawa's command averaged fewer than 275, with some possessing barely 100 hours in the cockpit. The merciless arithmetic of combat attrition had decimated Japan's aerial forces just as effectively as any conventional weapon ever could. The Imperial Navy had already sacrificed over 400 of its most experienced flyers at the Battle of Midway, lost another 250 during the clashes at the Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz, and watched hundreds more perish in the grinding meat grinder of the Solomon Islands campaign. Closing in on the Marianas on June 11th, the formidable American Armada organized itself into 4 distinct tactical units to maximize its offensive potential. Task Group 58.1, directed by Rear Admiral Joseph J. Clark, advanced with the Hornet, Yorktown, Belleau Wood, and Baton, while Task Group 58.2, under the command of Rear Admiral Alfred Montgomery, maneuvered the Bunker Hill, Wasp, Monterey, and Cabot into position. Simultaneously, Rear Admiral John Reeves guided Task Group 58.3, featuring his flagship Enterprise alongside the Lexington, San Jacinto, and Princeton. Finally, Task Group 58.4, overseen by Rear Admiral William Harrell, anchored the formation with the Essex, Langley, and Cowpens. Exactly at 1300 hours that afternoon, the initial wave of Essex-class fighters roared into the sky to commence a sweeping assault against Japanese air installations scattered across the Marianas. Spearheading this aggressive thrust, Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer guided 32 Hellcats from the VF-15 squadron off the deck of the USS Essex, setting a direct course for the enemy airfield at Eslido on Saipan. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat perfectly mirrored the core philosophy of the vessels that carried it, representing overwhelming battlefield supremacy achieved through the sheer force of American industrial mass production. Driven by a monstrous 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R280 double Wasp engine, this lethal machine could comfortably sustain speeds of 380 miles per hour and ascend to an altitude of 20,000 feet in exactly 7 minutes. Back on the USS Essex, radar operator First Class James Chen meticulously monitored the advancing fighter formation using his advanced SK air search radar, a sophisticated system capable of pinpointing airborne targets at distances reaching 100 miles and elevations up to 30,000 feet. He continuously paused the scanning array every few degrees to scrutinize the returning signals, calculating exact ranges and bearings for the incoming strike force. Awaiting them was a Marianas defense grid composed of roughly 500 Japanese planes, though only half of that number remained in flyable condition. When Brewer's Hellcats finally clashed with the initial wave of 30 intercepting Mitsubishi A6M0s at 1335, the ensuing dogfight proved brutally lopsided. The Zero, which had been a revolutionary marvel in 1940, was now entirely obsolete, severely handicapped by a maximum speed of 331 miles per hour, an agonizing 9.5-minute climb to 20,000 feet, and a fatal lack of pilot armor or self-sealing fuel tanks. I must point out to you that the most crucial factor was the severe inexperience of the Japanese aviators, who possessed an average of less than 200 hours of flight time, while a significant portion had logged under 100 hours. When you examine the initial day of fighting above the Marianas, it becomes clear how lopsided the engagement was, as 147 Japanese planes were obliterated, compared to a mere 11 American losses. The officer commanding Air Group 15 from the carrier Essex, Commander David McCampbell, would subsequently characterize the slaughter as being akin to clubbing baby seals. I can see why he felt that way, considering the enemy aviators flew in entirely predictable trajectories, struggled to keep their formations cohesive, and demonstrated remarkably deficient marksmanship. You will find that their battlefield communications were a tangled mess of conflicting and bewildered messages. Meanwhile, as Japanese naval intelligence monitored American radio transmissions emanating from Tawi-Tawi, they started to comprehend the sheer scale of the looming peril. Consequently, frantic and urgent dispatches were broadcast to Admiral Ozawa, commanding the mobile fleet, to depart at once in preparation for a climactic showdown, officially setting Operation Ago into motion. I should explain that this strategy relied upon land-based planes launching from the Maranas to strike and cripple the American flat tops, theoretically setting the stage for Ozawa's own carrier-based squadrons to administer the final, devastating blow. However, on the 13th of June, codebreakers stationed at Fleet Radio Unit Pacific successfully intercepted and deciphered the enemy's transmissions, laying bare Ozawa's entire blueprint for you and the Allied command to see. The decrypted intelligence revealed that the mobile fleet intended to depart from Tawi-Tawi, replenish their fuel reserves in the Philippine Sea, and subsequently assault the American amphibious forces stationed at Saipan. I want you to note the monumental choice made by Admiral Raymond Spruant, the commander of the Fifth Fleet, which ultimately dictated the flow of the entire engagement. Instead of aggressively chasing the Japanese armada, he decided that Task Force 58 would maintain a defensive posture near the invasion shores, effectively compelling Ozawa to bring the fight directly to them. Aboard the USS Yorktown, Executive Officer John Williamson methodically analyzed the spatial reality of the impending clash, recognizing immediately that the Japanese carrier-based planes possessed a noticeably superior operational reach compared to their American rivals. To give you an idea of the disparity, Zeros could traverse 1,940 miles relying solely on their internal fuel tanks, and both the Kates and the Val enjoyed a comparable level of endurance. Conversely, American Hellcats were limited to a combat radius of 340 miles. Helldivers could reach 276 miles, and Avengers were constrained to 275 miles. This stark contrast meant that Ozawa possessed the critical tactical luxury of launching his attack waves from well outside the American retaliatory envelope. Yet, as I look at the historical record, Williamson clearly grasped a fundamental truth that the Japanese had seemingly overlooked. Contemporary naval aviation had evolved beyond the simple metrics of individual aircraft specifications and now relied heavily on cohesive, integrated defensive networks. By combining radar-directed fighter coordination, proximity-fused anti-aircraft munitions, rigorous damage control protocols, and strict communication discipline, the Essex-class vessels held an overwhelming superiority in every single category, besides raw flight range. At 21:30 hours on the 18th of June, the submarine USS Kavala successfully pinpointed the Japanese mobile fleet roughly 360 miles west-southwest of Saipan. For 6 grueling hours, Lieutenant Commander Herman Clear shadowed the hostile armada, diligently broadcasting position updates that ultimately found their way to Spruance by 0300 hours on the 19th of June. The Japanese forces were steadily advancing from the west, remaining completely oblivious to the fact that you and the American commanders were already tracking their every move. As dawn broke on the 19th of June, 1944, the environmental variables aligned perfectly to support widespread aviation operations. With an infinite cloud ceiling, visibility stretching to 40 miles, mild easterly trade breezes blowing at 14 knots, and a gentle sea state, 3, characterized by rolling Pacific swells, the stage was flawlessly set for what I consider the most massive aircraft carrier confrontation in recorded history. At 0730 hours, radar technicians stationed on the USS Yorktown identified the initial Japanese assault force at a distance of 140 miles. This vanguard consisted of 69 machines advancing from the west at an altitude of 18,000 feet. Acting swiftly, Fighter Direction Officer Lieutenant Joseph Egot initiated the process of guiding the combat air patrol squadrons to intercept the incoming threat. The freshly deployed Grumman F-6 F-3 Hellcats, equipped with 6 50-caliber machine guns that each held 400 rounds of ammunition, rapidly ascended to meet the approaching adversaries. Lieutenant Alex Vasu, an aviator launching from the USS Lexington, who already boasted a record of 12 prior triumphs, was among the very first pilots to clash with the enemy. Recalling the surreal nature of the encounter, Vasu later noted how he was utterly astounded to see them flying in pristine, rigid formations, as if performing in an exhibition, completely devoid of defensive weaving or protective cover, as they maintained a strictly level and unswerving path. In a mere 8 minutes of intense aerial dogfighting, Vasu obliterated 6 Japanese planes, achieving the rare and prestigious status of an ace within a single day. The commander leading the Japanese strike, Lieutenant Commander Akira Terui from the carrier Taiho, had never before encountered a defensive screen guided precisely by radar interception. Averaging a mere 150 hours of flight time, his subordinate aviators were tragically ill-equipped to handle the beautifully orchestrated onslaught of the Hellcats, which plummeted from elevated rear positions to unleash their superior velocity and firepower with catastrophic results. Out of the 69 aircraft comprising that initial surge, an astounding 42 was swatted from the sky before they could even catch a glimpse of the American flotilla. Following this aerial massacre, at 0910 hours, the submarine USS Albaore unleashed a spread of 6 torpedoes aimed at the carrier Taiho from a distance of 5,000 yards. A single warhead ruptured the vessel's aviation fuel infrastructure, triggering a release of combustible vapors that I can only describe as a fatal turning point. When Damage Control Officer Commander Utaka Kobayashi mandated the reversal of the ventilation fans to purge the toxic fumes, he accidentally dispersed the highly explosive gasoline mist throughout the entirety of the ship's interior. At exactly 1000 hours, a massive second Japanese assault wave consisting of 128 warplanes descended upon the theater. Utilizing radar guidance, the defending Hellcats intercepted this massive formation a full 60 miles away from the vulnerable fleet. Providing his perspective on the skirmish, Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer, who spearheaded VF-15 from the Essex, recounted that the experience felt eerily similar to a routine practice drill as the enemy pilots flew directly into their crosshairs without attempting any evasive maneuvers whatsoever. I am always struck by his wingman's bewildered reaction, genuinely questioning whether they were actually participating in a real combat scenario, which makes perfect sense when you consider that 97 Japanese aircraft were annihilated during this second incursion. Simultaneously, the American surface vessels projected an impenetrable barrier of shrapnel into the sky, masterfully orchestrated by Mark 37 gun directors, equipped with precise radar ranging. The recently introduced proximity-fused munitions exploded automatically once they entered the lethal radius of an aircraft, completely eliminating the necessity for direct physical impacts. Consequently, those few Japanese aviators who managed to survive the gauntlet later testified that the American warships appeared to be encased within an invincible, continuous dome of violent detonations. As the afternoon progressed to 12:20 hours, the submarine USS Kavala successfully slammed 4 torpedoes into the hull of the seasoned carrier Shukaku. Although Captain Hiroshi Matsubara frantically commanded his crew to initiate counter-flooding measures, the inflicted structural devastation proved to be utterly catastrophic. I must remind you that while the Shukaku had miraculously endured the brutal engagements at the Coral Sea and the Eastern Solomons, 9 grueling months of relentless deployment without adequate maintenance had severely compromised her internal damage control infrastructure. As highly volatile aviation fuel cascaded from shattered reservoirs and vital electrical grids completely short-circuited, the doomed vessel eventually plunged beneath the waves 3 hours later, taking 1,263 souls down with her. Meanwhile, a third Japanese aerial contingent comprising 47 planes, which had taken off at 1000 hours, finally converged on the American Armada at 1300 hours. Out of that entire strike group, a pitiful 7 machines managed to limp back to their floating bases. As you reflect on the sheer scale of this defeat, consider the poignant testimony of fighter pilot Inen Kanayoshi Muto, one of the exceptionally rare survivors, who subsequently confessed that the American interceptors were absolutely everywhere, swarming above them, flanking their sides, and constantly hunting them from behind. In stark contrast, United States casualties amounted to merely 29 aircraft lost during aerial dogfights, while rescue teams successfully retrieved the vast majority of those downed aviators. This slaughter yielded a kill ratio surpassing 10-1, representing the most unbalanced atmospheric engagement witnessed throughout the entire global conflict. Boasting an average of 300 to 500 hours of cockpit experience, the American airmen methodically dismantled their hopelessly outmatched foes. At 15:40 on the 20th of June, reconnaissance planes deployed from the USS Enterprise spotted the withdrawing Imperial Armada 275 miles to the west-northwest of Task Force 58. Such a tremendous distance pushed well past the standard operational limits of American strike fighters. Consequently, retrieving these squadrons would have to take place under the cover of night, a hazardous practice heavily frowned upon by naval aviation guidelines. However, Admiral Mitcher, commonly referred to as Mitch, recognized that this perilous window could be the singular chance to utterly annihilate the remnants of the Japanese aerial navy. At 16:21, the commander issued the uncompromising directive to send every available machine into the air. Over the span of just 10 minutes, a staggering 240 planes roared off the flight decks of 11 different carriers, deploying 85 Hellcats, 77 dive bombers, and 54 torpedo bombers into the fading light. Managing gasoline consumption became an absolutely vital concern for every man in the cockpits. You must understand that these aviators acutely realized they possessed barely enough propellant to hit the enemy and navigate back, leaving absolutely zero room for mistakes. Prior to departure, Lieutenant Commander James Jig Dog Ramage, spearheading Bombing Squadron 10 off the USS Enterprise, delivered a grim warning to his subordinates. He explicitly warned his men that they were embarking on a one-way trip if they failed to monitor their gauges, commanding them to utilize lean engine mixtures, avoid any frivolous flight acrobatics, and execute merely a single attack run before making a direct sprint for their motherships. This immense strike package finally intercepted the adversary's vessels just as the sun dipped below the horizon. As shadows lengthened across the ocean, the carrier Hyo absorbed several devastating torpedo impacts delivered by Avengers from the Bellow Wood. Originally constructed as a civilian passenger liner, the aging warship lacked sufficient watertight compartments, causing her to slip beneath the waves within 2 hours, alongside 250 crew members. During this chaotic twilight assault, the carriers Zukaku and Chiyoda suffered severe structural harm, as did the mighty battleship Haruna. Navigating the pitch-black skies on the journey back transformed into a legendary test of human stamina and precise dead reckoning. With night fully enveloping the Pacific, countless engines started sputtering and dying due to dry fuel tanks. Desperate airmen were forced to splash down into the sea alongside escorting destroyers, while many others successfully reached the general area of the fleet, but remained unable to visually locate their designated landing decks in the profound gloom. At 20:45, Mitch executed a historic tactical choice that would cement his legacy forever. By ordering the fleet to illuminate everything they had, Every single vessel composing Task Force 58 suddenly became a blazing beacon in the night. Brilliant searchlight beams pierced straight up into the heavens, navigation bulbs glowed intensely, and flight deck markers perfectly traced the recovery zones, all while brilliant star shells continuously detonated in the atmosphere above them. Over the course of the next 2 hours, the Armada frantically welcomed the returning planes, with a significant number of pilots dropping their hooks onto whichever runway they could spot first. Although the operation resulted in the loss of 80 expensive aircraft, rescue teams managed to pull the majority of the downed aviators from the water safely. This daring twilight gamble exacted a heavy toll on the United States Naval Air Wing, yet it permanently extinguished the offensive capabilities of Japan's carrier forces. When the sun rose on the 21st of June, you could clearly perceive the sheer magnitude of the adversary's disaster. Across merely 48 hours of vicious engagements, the Imperial Japanese Navy was stripped of 3 massive fleet carriers, the Taihaho, the Shokaku, and the Hyo. Even more devastating to their long-term war effort was the eradication of roughly 476 to 600 aircraft, encompassing both naval and terrestrial squadrons, alongside the deaths of about 445 highly trained crewmen. Those few terrified survivors who managed to land on Admiral Ozawa's surviving flight decks wholly lacked the necessary proficiency and combat background to mount any future aggressive campaigns. Conversely, the United States suffered a total deficit of 123 machines and 76 fallen personnel. Crucially, however, Task Force 58 maintained a terrifying arsenal exceeding 750 fully functional warplanes manned by expert aviators. The unforgiving arithmetic of industrial-scale warfare made the conflict's ultimate outcome entirely predictable. Military academies in the United States were churning out 2,000 freshly minted naval pilots every single month. Every individual graduate benefited from 500 hours of rigorous cockpit instruction, which incorporated 50 hours dedicated specifically to mastering frontline operational aircraft, alongside sophisticated schooling in radar-guided intercepts, nocturnal maneuvering, and flying strictly by instrumentation. In depressing contrast, the opponent's educational pipeline had completely imploded, restricting new recruits to a meager 100 to 150 hours of overall flying time. Crippling petroleum deficits severely curtailed practice flights, while the military's desperation forced veteran instructors back to the front lines. Consequently, these drastically rushed curriculums yielded greenhorn flyers who struggled simply to achieve liftoff and safely touch down, completely incapable of surviving intense aerial dogfights. Evaluating the resulting battlefield dynamics, Commander David McCampbell, a man destined to become the Navy's premier ace with 34 confirmed victories, offered a sobering assessment. He noted that by June of 1944, the fearsome enemy armada that originally struck Pearl Harbor no longer existed, as its legendary airmen had all perished. Instead, the Americans found themselves fighting terrified kids who possessed only the most rudimentary grasp of aviation. The formidable Essex-class carriers and their massive air groups represented instruments perfectly optimized for an industrialized war of attrition, presenting a logistical nightmare the Japanese simply could not match. Rigorous statistical evaluations highlighted the terrifying operational tempo of the American naval forces. A single ship of this modern class possessed the capability to catapult an entire 40-plane strike package into the sky in 12 minutes, recover them all in 18 minutes, and have them fully rearmed and topped off with gas within 45 minutes. Hypothetically, an individual flight deck could unleash a trio of massive assaults within a mere 4-hour window. By synchronizing the efforts of 15 such leviathans, Task Force 58 wielded the apocalyptic power to place 600 warplanes above a hostile objective at the exact same moment. Consequently, the colossal clash at the Philippine Sea permanently broke the back of the adversary's carrier-based aviation beyond any hope of revival. Following the slaughter, Admiral Toyota delivered a remarkably candid and bleak evaluation of his military standing. He openly admitted that the primary mobile fleet had lost all aggressive utility, declaring their roster of aviators entirely exhausted, and insisting upon a shift toward alternative tactics. Roughly 4 months later, these extreme measures materialized as suicidal kamikaze dives, representing the ultimate, desperate fallback for a Navy utterly incapable of training conventional pilots. Having been plucked from the ocean following the catastrophic sinking of the Taihaho, Vice Admiral Ozawa finalized his official post-action dispatch on the 24th of June. In his concluding remarks, he conceded that the adversary's radar-controlled interception network operated with absolute perfection. He further acknowledged that the opposing flyers demonstrated an insurmountable superiority across every conceivable aspect of air combat. The incoming aerial assaults were completely neutralized well before approaching striking distance, effectively erasing the opposing mobile fleet's air groups as a viable military threat. Ultimately, the deployment of the Essex-class carriers proved the undeniable effectiveness of the United States strategy, which heavily relied on the immense scale of industrial mass production to dominate the theater of naval combat. Every newly constructed vessel integrated vital insights gained from prior engagements, featuring upgraded ventilation architectures designed to thwart the dangerous buildup of volatile gases. Furthermore, advanced damage control protocols ensured that heavily battered warships, such as the USS Franklin and USS Bunker Hill, could withstand devastating strikes that would have easily doomed older models. When looking at the sheer volume of manufacturing output, the utter hopelessness of the Japanese defensive efforts became glaringly obvious. By the middle of 1944, United States shipyards had successfully deployed 7 Essex-class aircraft carriers, with an astonishing 17 additional vessels actively being built. Facilities like the Newport News Shipbuilding Company were independently launching a massive new carrier every 6 months. This rapid pace was achieved by slashing the total manufacturing timeline down to a mere 14 months, a feat made possible through the implementation of highly standardized parts and highly efficient assembly line workflows. The disparity in military technology proved just as critical to the conflict's outcome. The United States utilized sophisticated radar networks that boasted 100-mile detection radiuses, alongside precise altitude tracking features. Furthermore, the Mark 37 gun director, when paired with the Mark 12 radar system, possessed the capability to lock onto enemy planes from 40,000 yards away. This tracking supremacy was amplified by VT proximity fuses, which dramatically multiplied anti-aircraft effectiveness by an astounding 300%. Centralized combat information centers managed these defensive operations, with a level of coordination and speed never before seen in naval history. Conversely, the opposition's technological advancement had essentially stalled, remaining anchored to the standards of 1941. The infamous Zero fighter, which had been considered groundbreaking at the onset of hostilities, saw only marginal upgrades over the years. Meanwhile, their radar arrays were basic and prone to failure, and their communication frameworks had become entirely outmoded. Perhaps most devastatingly, the Japanese Empire simply did not possess the manufacturing infrastructure required to translate battlefield experiences into improved vehicular blueprints. A stark contrast in strategic foresight was also evident in how both sides prepared their aviators for combat. The United States Navy Training Command managed 14 distinct air bases equipped with 10,000 instructional planes, successfully producing new flyers at a rate 3 times higher than their casualty numbers. Every recruit was required to meticulously navigate through primary, basic, advanced, and operational tiers of instruction before ever seeing a battlefield. To maintain a high standard of education, seasoned combat veterans were regularly cycled back to the mainland to serve as teachers, guaranteeing that the latest frontline tactics were seamlessly woven into the syllabus. In stark contrast, The opposing pilot preparation pipeline had degraded into drastically shortened courses that yielded barely competent airmen. The once prestigious Yukurin Initiative, renowned for forging top-tier naval aviators prior to 1942, was downgraded to merely conveying the absolute fundamentals of flight. Crippling fuel deficits forced the complete cancellation of advanced combat drills, meaning critical skills like formation flying, aerial gunnery, and navigational techniques were either severely neglected or entirely skipped. The resulting toll on human life was absolutely staggering. Among the 450 Japanese aviators who perished during the engagements in the Philippine Sea, the vast majority were highly seasoned veterans, boasting over a year of invaluable frontline exposure. When they died, an immense reservoir of institutional knowledge regarding complex carrier operations vanished instantly. The few who survived simply did not hold the necessary expertise to educate the next generation or to formulate innovative combat strategies. On the other side, the United States implemented personnel strategies specifically designed to preserve and distribute combat wisdom. Deployment durations were intentionally restricted to protect the lives of experienced pilots, while mandatory rotation schedules guaranteed that every active squadron featured a healthy balance of battle-hardened veterans and fresh recruits. Once their frontline commitments were fulfilled, these seasoned fighters were systematically reassigned to instructional facilities. This highly structured method of managing human resources ultimately proved to be just as critical to the war effort as any technological advantage. By the time October of 1944 arrived, prompting the Imperial Japanese Navy to launch its desperate final maneuver at Leyte Gulf, the formidable carrier armada that had once devastated Pearl Harbor was entirely gone. A mere 4 vessels sailed under the command of Admiral Ozawa, serving as a sacrificial diversionary tactic equipped with only 108 planes flown by inadequately prepared airmen. The ensuing confrontation near Cape Engano resembled a systemic execution rather than a traditional battle. United States aviation forces effortlessly sent all 4 enemy carriers to the bottom of the ocean, suffering the loss of a mere 10 planes in the process. While the Essex-class carriers would persistently project power for the remainder of the Pacific War, their most monumental triumph was already firmly cemented in history. Over the course of just 48 hours in the Philippine Sea, this fleet accomplished a strategic milestone that 3 grueling years of attritional warfare could not achieve. They systematically dismantled the opposing naval aviation network, entirely neutralizing it as a credible military threat. Admiral Chester Nimitz summarized this astonishing feat with an assessment that was remarkably humble given the magnitude of the event. These formidable vessels and their associated air groups stood as the ultimate embodiment of American industrial democracy mobilized for conflict. The harmonious integration of mass manufacturing, relentless technological innovation, and methodical pilot education birthed an overwhelming weapon system that the opposition was entirely incapable of matching or defending against. Consequently, the clash at the Philippine Sea transcended a mere tactical win. It served as a profound vindication of the United States' comprehensive philosophy regarding modern armed conflict. This profound legacy extended far beyond the conclusion of the Second World War. A total of 24 Essex-class carriers were eventually constructed, actively participating in subsequent conflicts in Korea and Vietnam, and maintaining their presence well into the 1970s. The USS Lexington, a battle-hardened survivor of the Philippine Sea engagements, continued active service all the way until 1991. This impressive longevity stands as a powerful testament to a resilient architectural design that permanently transformed the landscape of naval warfare. Deep within the dark waters of the Pacific Ocean, 3 sunken Japanese carriers lie silently on the seafloor, with their aircraft forever entombed in their hangars, and their crews still positioned at their final stations. These aquatic graves act as solemn monuments to a bygone era, marking the final instance where personal bravery and individual martial prowess could theoretically challenge the overwhelming tide of mechanized mass production. However, as Executive Officer Williamson so astutely recognized, the cold mathematics of industrial warfare were absolutely inescapable. The success of the Essex-class fleet proved much more than the ability to win a single engagement. It vividly demonstrated that the future of maritime combat would be dominated by nations possessing the infrastructure to mobilize massive industrial economies, foster rapid technological breakthroughs, and implement uniform training protocols on a monumental scale. The events in the Philippine Sea decisively closed the chapter on naval aviation being treated as a refined art form mastered by a select few elite warriors. Moving forward, global supremacy would belong to societies capable of converting warfare into a calculated industrial process, where triumph was dictated not by isolated acts of heroism, but by sheer manufacturing volume, total training hours, and superior engineering specifications. Ultimately, these mighty vessels, born from domestic shipyards and operated by everyday citizen sailors, irrevocably rewrote the foundational rules of naval engagement.